The United States Strategic Petroleum Reserve football, the use and abuse of an important asset. The United States Strategic Petroleum Reserve, or SPR, was created after the 1973 Yom Kippur War between Israel and a combined army of Middle East countries led predominantly by Egypt and Syria. The U.S. support of Israel during the war led to the OPEC oil embargoes of 1973 and 1974, which famously led to gas lines in the U.S. and spiking of gas prices. The U.S. in the 1970s was becoming less independent on domestic oil production and more reliant on Middle East oil, while the American demand for oil was sharply rising. The vulnerability of the U.S. economy to the oil shock caused by the embargo led to the creation of the SPR, and like all things in Washington, D.C., has at times moved from its original purpose to another tool to be wielded based on political whims. The U.S. SPR was created with the intent to give the U.S. a stockpile of oil that can be used in case of a national emergency, like a war or a natural disaster that disrupts U.S. supplies. It can also be used to tap into some event that occurs that disrupts the supply of oil, such as closing of shipping waterways such as the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf, or supply disruptions in the world oil market, such as the Iranian attacks through proxies in Yemen to Saudi Arabian oil fields, or the war in Ukraine disrupting the flow of Russian oil due to sanctions. The U.S. is a part of the International Energy Agency, the IEA strategy, with the goal of member countries to maintain a minimum supply equivalent of 90 days of average oil imports. There are currently 37 countries that attempt to meet this requirement, with the U.S. being the largest member. The idea that this is not only a buffer for a national emergency, but it can also be used to buffer any market swings in the price of oil due to oil disruptions caused by events such as a war or the need to use sanctions. When there's a disruption in the supply of oil, the IEA members can release, sell their reserves to domestic consumers or sell it internationally to inject the international oil market with additional oil and reduce the economic impact of the oil disruption. This works because oil is a fungible commodity, so releasing the oil, no matter the source country, will often soften the price spike, though not eliminate it. If for no other reason, it cannot immediately solve the disruption and the uncertainty in the oil futures. The U.S. has the authority to store up 714 million barrels as enacted by Congress. The U.S. SPR is primarily stored in underground salt caverns in geologically stable locations along the Gulf Coast of Texas and Louisiana. The U.S. currently imports an average of 8.5 million barrels of oil a day, which is the measure for the IEA's target, and it uses 20 million barrels of oil a day. The IEA recommendation is that 90 days is the minimum for average oil imports and not oil consumption, but the authorization for the SPR is only 84 days of the average imports. The U.S. SPR high point was in 2010 and part of 2011 with 727 million barrels stored, but by 2021 those levels had dropped to 638 million barrels. Russia is a member of OPEC Plus, and due to its decision to invade Ukraine, led to sanctions against the sale of Russian oil, which caused a supply disruption. The Biden administration stated in congressional hearings in early 2024 over the SPR that this was the reason the release of large quantities of the SPR so that it could stabilize the price of oil in the world market. This is a legitimate reason to use the SPR, but the administration has left out part of the drawdown that was unrelated to the Ukraine war. The U.S. levels of the SPR under Biden administration have been steadily declining since taking office. By the end of 2021, the SPR levels had declined to 594 million barrels, and by the time the Russian invasion had started, the administration had sold off 10% of the SPR. This was an attempt to bring down the oil prices due to spiking inflation in the U.S. that had increased from 1.7% in January 2021 to 7% by the end of 2021, and this is compared to the European Union inflation rate of 2.9% at the end of 2021. The release of SPR stockpiles was not to address oil disruptions, but to attempt to alleviate spiking prices across the U.S. economy due to the dramatic federal spending of the American Rescue Plan and other deficit budget spending that was partially financed by increasing the money supply. The selling of the SPR and spiking inflation all happened before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 resulted in a decision to apply sanctions against Russian oil and gas sales on the world market. This was a legitimate use of the SPR in the world because it gives the world leaders leverage to apply sanctions and mitigate the disruptions of the oil and gas markets caused by those sanctions. This cannot stop price increases, but it can keep prices of gas and oil from spiraling out of control while allowing world leaders not to be held hostage and kept from making foreign policy decisions against energy-producing nations. The European Union inflation rate by the end of 2022 had increased to 9.2%, and the U.S. was 6.5% due to these energy disruptions. The U.S. imports about one-third of its energy needs, so it is more energy self-sufficient than Europe, which is highly reliant on Russian energy. So its inflationary pressure was driven primarily, not exclusively, by energy prices, where the U.S. was primarily impacted by physical policy, though again, not exclusively. The U.S. SPR was reduced in 2022 from 588 million barrels to 372 million barrels, with the intent to stabilize the oil markets due to the Russian invasion, but continued to be depleted after the impact of the oil shock of the Russian invasion. The SPR levels continued to drop in 2023 when it reached a low of 347 million barrels in July 2023, and the last reported levels in January 2024 showed 358 million barrels. The administration announced in April 2024 that it is canceling current SPR replenishment purchases, and in the same week announced cancellation of several previously approved domestic oil leases. The administration has been using the SPR to help soften the impacts of its policy agendas. The cancellation of the pipelines and domestic leases has reduced the quantity of oil futures in the United States and creates increases in oil prices, as well as inflationary pressure in the U.S. because U.S. reduces the strength of the dollar through inflation, and the U.S. dollars is which is used for most international trading of oil contracts. The selling off the oil reserve could be seen as justified in 2022 after the Western oil sanctions on Russia, but once stability was returned in 2023, it is questionable for the need to keep selling off the SPR. Since the Biden administration has taken office, the SPR has been reduced by 208 million barrels and is now at levels not seen since 1983. At the high level, it can be interpreted that 135 million barrels were sold off during the Russian-Ukraine war impact, and 73 million barrels were sold to soften the impact of domestic gas prices in the U.S. due to inflationary budgetary decisions of the administration. The administration had tried to limit the selling off of the SPR in 2022 by requesting the Saudis to produce more oil and try to ease sanctions on Iran and Venezuela so that they could sell more oil, but when these failed to get the desired results, the selling of the SPR stockpiles were used. The SPR has been used to stabilizing the oil markets due to world events or natural disasters. It is an important tool in the case of national emergency such as a war, or international emergencies such as a war. Both are legitimate uses for the SPR and its purposes in the U.S. and IEA countries. It is not intended to soften the blow of impacts caused by either physical or monetary policy, just to hide the political impact of either policy on the U.S. electorate.